When we think of ancient Rome, the mind often conjures images of marble forums, gladiators in the Colosseum, or emperors lounging in villas, issuing decrees between mouthfuls of grapes. But there's another side to the story, one that smells less of grandeur and more of sour wine, the hangover. Because if one thing united emperors and peasants, senators and soldiers, it was wine, gallons of the stuff, flowing through daily life. And where there is wine, there is inevitably the morning after. To understand the Roman hangover, we must first grasp the Roman relationship with alcohol. For the Romans, wine wasn't simply a drink. It was a cultural cornerstone, a political tool, and even a mark of civilization. To drink wine was to be Roman. To abstain entirely was often viewed with suspicion unless you were a priest or ascetic. Grapes wine as daily bread. Wine was so integral to Roman life that it was consumed at every social level. Soldiers on campaign were given wine rations. Farm laborers drank it diluted with water in the fields. Senators sipped finer vintages in marble atria while discussing statecraft. Even slaves were provided with basic wine, though theirs was often little better than sour vinegar. The sheer scale of production boggles the mind. Vineyards covered vast stretches of Italy, Gaul, and Hispania. Amphorae of wine crisscrossed the Mediterranean in such numbers that archaeologists today still find their broken shards forming artificial hills. Wine wasn't just an agricultural product, it was the lifeblood of empire. But this ubiquity came with consequences. With so much wine available, overindulgence was common. And the after effects, pounding heads, queasy stomachs, and foul tempers, were as familiar in Rome as they are today. Wineglass, the strength of Roman wine. One key detail about Roman wine, it was usually stronger and sweeter than most modern varieties. Without modern fermentation control, Roman vintners often produced heavy, syrupy wines with high alcohol content. To make them drinkable, it was standard practice to dilute wine with water, often at ratios of 1:2 or even 1:3. Drinking wine neat was considered barbaric, a sign of uncivilized excess more fitting for Gauls or Germans than refined Romans. And yet, despite this convention, plenty of Romans did drink to excess. Banquets often stretched for hours, with hosts eager to impress by keeping cups brimming. Drinking games were popular, particularly among soldiers and students, who egged one another into consuming cup after cup. By the time the lamps guttered out, stomachs were sloshing with wine, and the stage was set for the inevitable reckoning come dawn. Classical building hashed the banquet culture. To truly appreciate Roman hangovers, one must imagine the banquet, the convivium. Reclining on couches, diners feasted on roasted meats, fish, honey cakes, and figs, while slaves circulated with amphorae, endlessly refilling cups. Conversation, politics, philosophy, and gossip flowed alongside the wine. Music, dancing, and sometimes even acrobatic performances provided entertainment. The wine was rarely enjoyed in moderation. Roman writers often lament the gluttony of such feasts, mocking senators who staggered home at dawn, bleary-eyed and reeking. Petronius Satyricon, a satirical novel, paints grotesque portraits of drunken hosts slurring speeches, vomiting mid-meal, or collapsing into snores before the last course. These feasts were spectacles of indulgence, and the hangovers that followed were equally spectacular. Disefface the Roman morning after. So what was it like waking up in Rome after a night of wine-soaked revelry? Imagine the scene. the sun's already hot, streaming through the shutters. Your head pounds as if legionary drummers have set up camp inside your skull. Your mouth tastes of sour grapes and ashes. The amphora you kicked over in the night has stained the mosaic floor. Somewhere in the street, hawkers are already bellowing about olives and garum, their voices like daggers in your ears. The wealthy might summon slaves with cool water, bread, or herbal concoctions to soothe the stomach. The poor, less fortunate, might simply groan in straw beds, clutching their heads as they prepared for another day's labor. But whether patrician or plebeian, the sensation of overindulgence was the same. Hangovers, it seems, are the great leveler of humanity. Scales hash wine, virtue, and vice. It's important to note that the Romans weren't ignorant of the dangers of excess. Philosophers like Seneca wrote scathingly about drunkenness, describing it as a surrender of reason and dignity. Cato the Elder railed against wine-soaked indulgence, seeing it as a symptom of Rome's moral decline. And yet, despite such admonitions, the culture of heavy drinking persisted. Perhaps because wine was so central to social life, avoiding it entirely was almost impossible. The Romans lived with this tension, celebrating wine as a gift of civilization, yet warning against its abuses. And caught in between were ordinary people, staggering out of banquets, clutching temples, and swearing, as we still do, never again. Face with tears of joy universality of the hangover. There's something deeply human about the Roman hangover. Across the centuries, the sensations remain the same: the pounding head, the dry throat, the regret, and the sudden vows of moderation. Reading ancient texts about drunken revelry, one almost hears the same weary groans echoing down the millennia. The amphora may have changed into bottles, the couches into pub stools, but the morning after is eternal. When we raise a glass of wine today, we expect something clear, balanced, and relatively predictable. Ancient Romans, however, would have been shocked at the idea of such refined uniformity. For them, wine was wildly diverse, often murky, sometimes spiced, occasionally salted, and almost always stronger than what we're used to. And every sip they took carried with it not just flavor, but the likelihood of a ferocious headache the next morning. Wine glass: the hierarchy of Roman wines. Roman society loved to classify, and wine was no exception. The finest vintages came from celebrated regions like Falernian, Caecuban, and Marsic. Falernian, in particular, was legendary, so potent that it could apparently be lit with a flame. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, described Falernian as lasting for decades in storage, growing stronger with age. Only the wealthy elite could afford it, and it was usually served at elite banquets where senators reclined in luxury. At the other end of the spectrum were the sour, cheap wines given to slaves and laborers. Known as posca, this was essentially vinegar mixed with water, sharp, acidic, and hardly the stuff of indulgence, but enough to quench thirst and sterilize dubious water supplies. Soldiers drank posca regularly on campaign, as it was portable, refreshing, and safer than plain river water. So, on one end, Falernian, dazzlingly strong, a drink of emperors. On the other, posca, sour and functional, the drink of soldiers and slaves. In between lay a vast range of wines, differing by region, grape, and method, but nearly always doctored with additives that would make modern sommeliers faint. Additives, salt, sea water, and more. Romans rarely drank wine pure. To them, raw wine was unfinished, even uncivilized. They added all sorts of ingredients, some to improve flavor, others to preserve the liquid, and still others simply out of culinary whimsy. One common additive was seawater, producing a salty tang. The result was a wine called mulsum mare, often reserved for special occasions. Imagine sipping a briny vintage after a feast, refreshing perhaps on the palate, but not so friendly to the stomach by dawn. Other additives included resin, pitch, or ash, which helped seal amphorae and preserve wine but also imparted smoky or bitter flavors. Spices such as cinnamon, pepper, and saffron were occasionally stirred in, turning wine into something closer to mulled cider. Honeyed wine, mulsum, was a perennial favorite, sweet and intoxicating, beloved at feasts and festivals. And then there were the bizarre concoctions: wine mixed with goat's milk, wine steeped with herbs like wormwood, a forerunner to absinthe, even wine mixed with chalk or marble dust to reduce acidity. Each additive alters not only the taste but also the potency, and, inevitably, the hangover. Grapes amphorae, storage, and spoilage. Another factor was storage. Wine was transported in clay amphorae sealed with resin or pitch. Over time, these could impart strong flavors, some pleasant, others less so. Unlike our modern sealed bottles, Roman wine was vulnerable to spoilage. Sour, musty, or overly oxidized vintages were common. But waste was not tolerated. Bad wine might be reboiled, rediluted, or heavily spiced to disguise its flaws. This meant that Roman drinkers often consumed wine laced with preservatives and disguises. No wonder their hangovers were legendary. Imagine guzzling a concoction of high-proof, resin-tainted, seawater-salted, honey-thick wine until late in the night. The next morning, one's temples would feel as though Neptune himself were pounding a trident inside. Scales # dilution, civilization versus barbarism. A crucial element of Roman drinking was dilution. To drink wine undiluted was considered barbaric, the kind of thing Germans or Thracians did. Civilized Romans mixed wine with water, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, in ratios that varied depending on the occasion. At banquets, the host usually decided the mix. But while dilution theoretically reduced drunkenness, it didn't prevent hangovers. In fact, drinking large quantities of diluted but still potent wine might have worsened matters. Guests might drink far more than they realized, stretching feasts into the small hours, each cup chipping away at the next day's well-being. Face with tears of joy the taste of excess. Contemporary writers sometimes mock the odd tastes that resulted from all these experiments. Martial, the witty poet, sneered at wine so salty it could pickle fish. Juvenal lampooned drunken aristocrats belching up honeyed concoctions. Clearly, not every mix was a success. Yet Romans persisted, endlessly creative in their adulteration of wine, never content with plain grape juice. One imagined slaves groaning as they prepared yet another bizarre recipe for their master's feast. He wants pepper in the wine again? That'll give him bowels like Vesuvius tomorrow. Globe showing Europe-Africa hangover implications. So what did all this mean for hangovers? In a word, brutality. Roman wines were stronger, dirtier, and more adulterated than ours. Additives like seawater, pitch, and ash only worsened the body's reaction. Drinking until dawn on a diet of salty, resin-flavored Falernian was a recipe for migraines, nausea, and stomach cramps. Yet Romans embraced the risk. To drink was to live Roman eaters, to be civilized, sociable, and part of the empire's culture. The pain of the morning after was the price of admission. If the amphora was the bloodstream of Roman society, the banquet, or convivium, was its beating heart. These weren't casual dinners. They were orchestrated spectacles of food, philosophy, politics, and above all, wine. But woven into the elegance of reclining couches and golden platters were rituals and games that pushed the boundaries of moderation. For anyone unlucky enough to wake the next morning, these feasts were the mother of all hangovers. Couch and lamp hash reclining to drink. The Romans didn't simply sit at table. They reclined on couches arranged around a central table, usually 3 to a couch, propped up on the left elbow so the right hand was free for eating and drinking. This posture was a symbol of civilization, borrowed from the Greeks, and it carried one clear implication: the feast was not meant to be rushed. Guests lounged for hours, sipping steadily, their cups endlessly replenished by attentive slaves. The very design of the banquet encouraged overindulgence. Reclining made eating and drinking easier, and with entertainment unfolding, musicians, poets, dancers, it was easy to lose track of how much one had consumed. Wineglass the symposiarch, master of drinking. Every banquet required a symposiarch, the master of the feast who decided the ratio of wine to water and oversaw the rhythm of drinking. In theory, this ensured moderation. In practice, it often meant mischief. A generous symposiarch could decree that the evening's wine be mixed lightly, encouraging steady but relentless drinking. A mischievous one might push stronger ratios, goading guests into inebriation. The role gave structure to the evening, but it also placed pressure on guests to conform. Refusing to drink when the symposiarch poured could be seen as rude. And so, cups were drained, again and again, until conversation slurred and tempers wobbled. Game day drinking games. To make matters worse, or livelier, depending on your perspective, Romans loved drinking games. Borrowing from Greek customs, one popular game was kotabos, where players flicked dregs of wine at a target, often a dish balanced on a pole. Success was greeted with cheers, failure with jeers. The point was not just fun but also flirtation, as players often dedicated their shots to lovers present at the feast. Other games included reciting improvised poetry while tipsy, answering riddles, or daring one another to drink more. Dice and knucklebones were rolled for drinking forfeits. Imagine a raucous room where half-drunk senators were flicking wine across the table, laughing too loudly, and challenging each other to yet another round. The hangover the next morning was practically built into the rules. Grapes vomitoria, myth and reality. A popular myth claims that Romans built special vomitoria in their banquets to allow guests to purge and continue eating and drinking. In truth, vomitorium referred architecturally to the exits of amphitheaters, the passageways that allowed crowds to spew out quickly. But the myth isn't entirely misplaced. Romans did indeed sometimes induce vomiting during feasts, not through architecture but by choice. Elite diners, eager to prolong their indulgence, occasionally excused themselves to purge and return for more. Seneca scathingly describes men who vomit so they may eat, and eat so they may vomit. While not the norm, this grotesque practice added fuel to the hangover fire, the body battered by excess, deprived of nutrients, and yet soaked in wine. Multiple musical notes, entertainment and escalation. Banquets weren't quiet affairs. Musicians played lutes and flutes, dancers twirled, acrobats leapt, poets recited, and sometimes gladiators or actors performed. The spectacle encouraged guests to keep drinking, as wine dulled inhibitions and loosened tongues. By midnight, the atmosphere might be closer to a wild festival than a polite dinner. With each performance came another toast, another round. Laughter grew louder, speech slurred, and arguments occasionally flared. Roman writers gleefully record feasts ending in brawls, smashed cups, and spilled amphorae, the ancient equivalent of a bar fight after closing time. Scales hash social expectations. Banquets were also stages for politics and networking. To decline a drink, to bow out early, or to appear too sober might suggest arrogance or aloofness. Guests often drank to prove loyalty, camaraderie, or masculinity. The social pressure was immense, and it pushed many beyond their limits. Imagine the young senator in waiting, desperate to impress his patron, matching him cup for cup until both are swaying. The next morning, he wakes with a skull-splitting headache, but at least he has advanced his career. Face with tears of joy the human comedy. It's easy to picture the comic side. A guest, too drunk to stand, topples backwards off his couch, still clutching a cup. Another, overconfident in cotabos, accidentally splashes the host's toga with dregs, provoking uproarious laughter. Meanwhile, a slave sighs as he refills yet another cup, muttering that he'll be the one scrubbing vomit off the mosaic tomorrow. Globe showing Europe-Africa hangover implications. These banquet rituals all but guaranteed hangovers. Hours of reclining, relentless top-ups, drinking games, and the occasional purge meant that by the time dawn broke, guests were dehydrated, nutrient-starved, and suffering the full brunt of alcohol's poison. And yet, banquets remained central to Roman culture, symbols of wealth, friendship, and identity. The hangover was simply the tax of participation. It is dawn in Rome. The sun rises over tiled rooftops, spilling its brightness into courtyards and alleyways. For some citizens, the day begins briskly. Bakers are already at their ovens, vendors hawk olives and bread, and senators are preparing for debates in the forum. But for others, those who staggered home from a banquet hours earlier, the morning is torture. The Roman hangover has arrived. Some with face waking in pain. Imagine lying on a low bed, head pounding like legionary drums at parade. Your mouth is dry, coated with the sour taste of last night's Falernian. The sweet honeyed wine that seemed so delightful in the lamplight now clings to your throat like syrupy bile. Your stomach churns, equal parts hunger and nausea, and every shout from the street feels like Jupiter himself is striking thunderbolts at your skull. For the wealthy, there is at least the mercy of attendants. Slaves draw back curtains, bring basins of water, and perhaps offer bread or herbs. For the poor, there is no such comfort, only the grim necessity of rising from a straw pallet and stumbling off to work, head throbbing, body sluggish, temper short. Wineglass Roman descriptions of drunkenness. Roman writers were not shy about mocking the after-effects of indulgence. Seneca, ever the moralist, rails against men who carry last night's drunkenness into today, eyes heavy, breath foul, limbs trembling. Juvenal paints pictures of elite staggering through the forum, still reeking of garlicky wine, their speech slurred as they attempt to conduct business. These accounts remind us that hangovers were not simply physical, they were public embarrassments. To be seen in the forum with bleary eyes and a wobbling gait was to invite ridicule. A man's reputation might survive a single night of excess, but repeated appearances in such a state marked him as weak, decadent, and untrustworthy. Face with bandaged head the symptoms. So what exactly did the Roman hangover feel like? Much the same as ours, but perhaps intensified by the peculiarities of their wine. Headaches, exacerbated by strong, resin-tainted, or salt-laced wine. Dry mouth and thirst, worsened by seawater additives and hours of reclining with little water. Nausea and vomiting, not only from alcohol but from the heavy food and oils consumed at banquets. Shaking and weakness, described in texts as limbs that fail to obey. Irritability, Roman satirists gleefully record short tempers, quarrels, and self-pity. Add to this the hot Mediterranean climate, with its relentless sun, and you have a recipe for misery. To wake hungover in Rome wasn't just to suffer inside, it was to step into a city that made no concessions for your fragility. Classical building hash responsibilities and regret. The truly cruel part of the Roman hangover was that life didn't pause for recovery. Senators still had to appear in the forum, soldiers still had to drill, farmers still had to tend the fields. Imagine a centurion, face pale, barking orders while suppressing bile, or a young senator nodding off mid-speech as his colleagues snickered. And all the while, the regrets began. Romans swore the same oaths we do, never again. Cicero once lamented that those who drink heavily wake with a body more burdened than refreshed, with strength diminished, with judgment clouded. Yet the cycle repeated, because banquets were irresistible, politically necessary, socially vital, and personally enjoyable in the moment. Face with tears of joy the humor of the morning after. There's a certain comedy in imagining the morning streets of Rome filled with hungover citizens. One man stumbles into a fountain, seeking cool relief. Another vomits discreetly into a gutter while pretending to greet a neighbor. Slaves whisper and chuckle as their masters groan dramatically, clutching temples as though they were the victims of divine punishment. Even the gods were dragged into it. Some Romans blamed their misery on Bacchus, the god of wine, accusing him of cruelty. Others begged Mercury, patron of tricksters, to spare them further humiliation. The hangover was not just physical, it was woven into the myth and humor of Roman life. Globe showing Europe-Africa the universality of suffering. Perhaps the most striking thing is how little has changed. The Roman morning after sounds almost identical to our own. The same headaches, the same parched throats, the same vows of moderation. Time collapses when it comes to hangovers. A Roman citizen groaning in 50 BCE is indistinguishable from a student groaning in 2025 CE. Civilizations may rise and fall, but human biology remains constant. Every culture that has discovered alcohol has also discovered the hangover, and, inevitably, invented cures. Ancient Rome was no exception. Faced with pounding headaches, queasy stomachs, and parched throats, Romans turned to an impressive arsenal of remedies. Some were practical, rooted in observation. Others were comically strange, closer to superstition than science. Together they paint a vivid picture of how Romans tried, and often failed, to outwit the wine god Bacchus the morning after. The cabbage cure. Perhaps the most famous Roman hangover remedy was the humble cabbage. Cato the Elder, in his stern and practical De Agricultura, devoted passages to the plant's virtues, praising it as almost a miracle food. According to Cato, cabbage eaten raw before a banquet could prevent drunkenness. If consumed afterwards, it supposedly soothed the stomach and reduced the after-effects of wine. Why cabbage? Modern science suggests it may indeed have had some effect. Cabbage is high in water and fiber, aiding hydration and digestion. It also contains compounds that help the liver process toxins. So while Cato's faith may sound quaint, there was method in his madness. One can picture Romans crunching down raw cabbage leaves at feasts, grimacing at the taste but hopeful of a lighter head come morning. Egg the owl egg and other oddities. But the remedies didn't stop at cabbage. Pliny the Elder, indefatigable collector of curiosities, lists stranger treatments in his Natural History. Among them, the egg of an owl, consumed whole, to banish the effects of drunkenness. Quite how many people manage to stomach such a cure is anyone's guess. Other suggestions included eating roasted sheep's lungs, applying fried canary to the forehead, or sipping a mixture of myrrh and aloe. Some Romans swore by amulets, charms or herbs tied around the neck to ward off Bacchus' revenge. Clearly, Desperation pushed people into trying almost anything. Honeypot honey and sweet relief. A more palatable cure was honey. Romans mixed honey with water or wine to create mulsum, a sweet tonic often taken before and after feasts. Honey provided quick sugar, soothing raw throats and settling the stomach. Combined with warm water, it may have functioned as a primitive rehydration drink, closer to a sports beverage than a miracle potion. Indeed, modern doctors sometimes recommend honey for hangovers, since fructose helps speed up alcohol metabolism. Perhaps the Romans stumbled on a truth without fully understanding the chemistry. Glass of milk, eggs, and the Roman prairie oyster. Some remedies sound suspiciously familiar. A common cure was a raw egg stirred into wine or water, not unlike the modern prairie oyster beloved by students and bartenders. The idea was to coat the stomach, absorb toxins, and replenish strength. Milk, too, was recommended by some writers, though it often curdled unpleasantly in the wine-heavy stomach. The combination of milk, eggs, and wine probably left many Romans retching, but at least it showed a consistent effort to line the stomach and calm the gut. Scales # prevention versus cure. Roman hangover wisdom often emphasized prevention. The cabbage cure was preventative. So was the practice of sipping water or eating lettuce alongside wine. Moderation, of course, was the best safeguard, and philosophers like Seneca urged it constantly. But as long as banquets demanded excess, Romans kept looking for quick fixes the next morning. It's worth noting that some remedies may have been psychological. Believing in a cure often provided relief, even if the cure itself was inert. The owl egg may not have healed the liver, but faith in its power may have soothed the mind. Placebo effects are as ancient as humanity itself. Face with tears of joy the comic side of remedies. The image of noble senators solemnly downing owl eggs or tying amulets around their necks is ripe for humor. One imagined slaves rolling their eyes as their masters demanded yet another bizarre concoction. "Fetch me the roasted sheep's lung, boy. My temples pound like Vulcan's hammer." And of course, many cures likely made things worse. Rich food on an unsettled stomach, foul mixtures of herbs and oils, these may have deepened nausea rather than relieved it. Yet the cycle persisted, fueled by hope and desperation. Globe showing Europe-Africa universality of the cure hunt. Roman hangover cures remind us of something deeply human, the refusal to accept suffering without a remedy. From cabbage leaves in Rome to greasy breakfasts in Britain, people across ages and cultures have sought salvation in food, drink, or ritual. The hangover, eternal though it may be, has always spurred creativity. For every Roman noble waking with a pounding skull and a sour stomach, there were others already hard at work dealing with the aftermath, slaves and servants. The hangover in ancient Rome wasn't a solitary misery. It rippled outward, creating labor and indignities for those whose job it was to clean, cook, fetch, and soothe. In fact, the story of the Roman morning after is just as much theirs as it is the revelers. Bed # the groaning awakening. Picture a wealthy senator sprawled on a couch or bed, toga rumpled, breath foul from last night's Falernian. The first thing he does upon waking is not to grope for water himself but to bark hoarsely for a slave. Attendants hurry in with bowls of cool water for washing the face, basins for rinsing the mouth, and sometimes perfumed oils to mask the smell of sour wine. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about dignity. A Roman of status could not be seen in disarray. Slaves ensured that by the time the master staggered into public view, he looked polished, even if he felt half dead inside. Bread, food, drink and cures on demand. Next came the demands for food or cures. Some masters insisted on cabbage leaves, others on honey water, others on bizarre recipes like owl eggs or sheep's lungs. It was the slave's task to procure and prepare these, often at short notice. Imagine the scramble through kitchens and markets, all before the master grew too irritable. Failure or delay could mean punishment. A slave who brought tepid water instead of cold, or wilted cabbage instead of fresh, might be struck or shouted at. In this way, the Roman hangover was not only physical suffering for the master but also social suffering for the servant. Cleaning the carnage. And then there was the mess. Roman banquets, especially raucous ones, often left behind overturned cups, spilled amphorae, greasy platters, and, in the worst cases, pools of vomit on mosaic floors. Slaves were the ones to clean it all before dawn, scrubbing floors, washing couches, and airing out rooms. The more spectacular the feast, the more dreadful the cleanup. Perfumed oils had to be replenished, cushions fluffed, and broken pottery swept away. For slaves, the banquet didn't end when guests stumbled home, it ended when every trace of their debauchery had been erased. Face with bandaged head bearing the brunt of tempers. Hangovers are not known for making people kind. Ancient Roman elites were no exception. Many slaves bore the brunt of their masters' foul moods, enduring curses, slaps, or humiliations. One can imagine a bleary-eyed senator yelling at his attendant for the sun being too bright, or accusing a kitchen slave of spoiling the cabbage cure. Literary sources hint at this dynamic. Roman satire often paints masters as ridiculous in their mourning after irritability, but behind the humor was a darker truth: slaves paid the price for their owners' indulgence. Hear the gossip of servants. Yet slaves were not merely passive. They observed, remembered, and sometimes mocked their masters' excesses. Servants at banquets saw senators fall asleep mid-speech, patricians vomit on prized togas, and matrons snore through songs. In whispered conversations, these memories circulated among the household staff, building a private culture of gossip. It is tantalizing to imagine the running commentary: "Our master boasted he could outdrink Lucius, now look at him, groaning like a wounded boar. And we're the ones scrubbing up the mess." Such humor would have been a small act of resistance, a way to take the edge off thankless labor. Scales: hash masters versus laborers. It's important to remember that slaves weren't the only ones to face hangovers. Laborers, soldiers, and artisans also drank heavily. But the difference lay in who had support. A poor farmer might wake hungover and still stumble off to toil in the fields with no one to ease his pain. A wealthy Roman, by contrast, relied on the invisible army of servants to carry him through. Thus, the hangover in Rome was a marker of class. The wealthy suffered more conspicuously but less practically, cushioned by service. The poor suffered quietly but without reprieve. Face with tears of joy the comic side. There is also comic potential in imagining the gap between master and servant perspectives. For the master, the morning after was a noble battle against Bacchus' cruelty. For the slave, it was simply another day cleaning up wine stains and fetching dubious cures. The pomp of Roman excess shrank to the pitiful sight of a grown man moaning for cabbage leaves. One imagines a weary slave muttering, "If cabbage truly cured hangovers, half of Rome would be a cabbage patch by now." Globe showing Europe-Africa legacy of service. The role of slaves in Roman hangovers reminds us of the broader reality of Roman life. Luxury was always built on labor. The splendor of banquets, the relief of cures, even the dignity of appearing respectable in public, all rested on the invisible toil of servants. Their story is inseparable from the hangover tale, a shadow narrative of endurance and humor beneath the marble facades. While most Romans happily indulged in wine and suffered its consequences, not everyone was so forgiving. The philosophers, moralists, and stern critics of Roman society cast a gimlet eye over drunkenness, treating it not as harmless fun but as a symptom of moral collapse. To them, the hangover was not simply a physical punishment, it was evidence of a deeper sickness eating away at Rome's soul. Scroll the Stoics' scorn. The Stoics, with their emphasis on discipline, reason, and self-control, had little patience for drunkenness. Seneca, perhaps the most famous Roman Stoic, did not mince his words. In his letters, he rails against men who carry yesterday's drunkenness into today, eyes heavy, lips trembling, bodies reeking. For Seneca, wine was not the problem in itself. Taken moderately, it could warm the spirit. The problem was excess. To stagger about the forum, slurring speeches, and vomiting in corners, was to betray reason, the very essence of humanity. The hangover, to Seneca, was simply nature's way of showing a man how far he had fallen. Drunkenness, he wrote, is nothing but voluntary madness. What greater proof of that madness than waking broken, ashamed, and enslaved to a cup? Classical building # Cato the Elder, the stern farmer. Long before Seneca, Cato the Elder, 234 to 149 BCE, had set the tone for Roman disdain of excess. A farmer, statesman, and moralist, he embodied the old republican virtues of simplicity and austerity. Cato praised the virtues of cabbage and moderation, scoffing at luxury. For him, heavy drinking and its hangover symbolized everything that threatened Rome: softness, greed, and foreign corruption. Cato's moralizing had political teeth. By ridiculing the drunken elites, he positioned himself as a champion of old Roman toughness. The morning after groans of patricians were, to him, signs of a nation going soft. Scales # philosophical arguments. The philosophers framed their criticism in broader terms. Drunkenness, they argued, robbed men of their dignity. It clouded judgment, making soldiers less effective, senators less rational, and citizens less virtuous. A society addicted to excess was a society on the path to ruin. The hangover, then, was a visible mark of vice. To wake bleary-eyed and shaking was to announce to the world, "I lost control." For philosophers obsessed with virtus, manly virtue, this loss was damning. Faced with tears of joy, the satirists' jabs. While philosophers thundered, satirists chuckled. Juvenal and Martial mocked the drunken elite with relish. Martial in particular delighted in painting word pictures of noblemen staggering into court still stinking of Falernian, or of women with smudged coal and hiccups the morning after. For the satirists, the hangover was comedy gold, proof that the high and mighty were just as ridiculous as anyone else when their stomachs heaved and their heads throbbed. Their laughter, however, had a moral edge. By ridiculing drunkenness, they reinforced the idea that it was shameful. To appear hungover in public was not only unhealthy, it was laughable, a blot on one's dignity. Wineglass the contradictions of Roman morality. And yet, for all this moralizing, Rome never abandoned its banquets. Senators who thundered against decadence one day might recline in drunken revelry the next. Even Seneca admitted to enjoying wine in moderation. The reality was that wine was too deeply embedded in Roman identity to ever be renounced. This created a delicious contradiction. Philosophers condemned drunkenness, yet society continued to indulge. Hangovers were simultaneously mocked, pitied, and inevitable. They became part of the rhythm of life, a tolerated shame. Thinking faced the hangover as metaphor. Beyond the literal, philosophers often used the hangover as a metaphor for regret and excess in life. Just as too much wine left one weak and reeling, too much indulgence in luxury, sex, or power left the soul degraded. The morning after headache became a symbol for moral hangovers, the price of living without moderation. In this way, the Roman hangover transcended biology. It became a cultural lesson, a tool for teaching self-control. The groaning senator wasn't just a man with a headache, he was a warning against losing sight of virtue. Globe showing Europe, Africa eternal lessons. The philosophers may not have cured hangovers, but they gave them meaning. They turned the misery of the morning after into a moral allegory. And though their stern lectures rarely stopped Romans from drinking, they remind us of the age-old tension between pleasure and virtue. Wine brings joy in the evening, regret in the morning, a truth as relevant in a London pub as it was in a Roman villa. If senators suffered the indignity of staggering through the forum with bleary eyes, Roman soldiers endured something far worse, the legionary hangover. Imagine waking with a pounding skull only to be ordered into full kit, marching 20 miles beneath a Mediterranean sun, or digging fortifications until your hands blistered. For the Roman army, wine was as essential as bread, but so too was discipline. And the hangover was often a companion on campaign. Wineglass wine rations on campaign. Roman soldiers weren't just permitted to drink, they were expected to. Wine was part of their daily ration, alongside grain, oil, and sometimes vinegar. Water was often unsafe, especially in foreign lands, so diluted wine was the standard beverage. Soldiers drank posca, sour wine vinegar mixed with water, to quench thirst, refresh themselves, and disinfect dubious water supplies. But soldiers also drank stronger wine when they could get it, especially after a victory, during festivals, or while stationed in garrisons with little else to do. Archaeological finds of amphorae near military camps attest to the quantities consumed. Wine was both comfort and currency, traded, shared, and hoarded. Shield # drinking culture of the legion. Drinking was also about camaraderie. Soldiers bonded over cups, told stories, sang bawdy songs, and competed in drinking games much like civilians. The difference was that soldiers had to answer for their indulgence at dawn. A centurion's whip, or the harsh bark of orders, cut through the fog of a hangover mercilessly. To falter on the march because of drunkenness risked shame or punishment. The army tolerated drinking but despised weakness. Thus, legionaries developed a stoic approach: drink when you can, suffer when you must, and march regardless. Disface the morning after in armor. Picture a soldier waking in a leather tent after a night of Falernian shared among comrades. His head throbs, his mouth tastes of ash, and his stomach lurches as he straps on heavy armor. The shield alone weighs 10 kilos, the pack, another 20. The legion begins its march, dust rising in the heat, drums and horns blaring. Each step sends shocks through the skull, each glare of the sun burns the eyes. By midday, sweat pours, dehydration deepens, and the hangover feels like punishment from Mars himself. Yet there is no choice but to press on. Discipline demanded endurance, and hangovers were simply part of the soldier's burden. Scales # remedies in the field. Soldiers relied on practical cures. Posca doubled as rehydration fluid, replenishing salts lost to sweat. Simple foods, bread, beans, dried fruit, helped settle the stomach. Some may have chewed herbs or garlic, thought to restore vigor. And of course, the cure most often prescribed was simply to drink again, hair of the dog, Roman style, with another draught of sour wine to dull the ache. There are hints that commanders sometimes issued lighter duties after festivals, recognizing the futility of demanding perfect discipline from a hungover camp. But on campaign, mercy was rare. The empire was built on relentless discipline, and a man who couldn't march was a liability. Classical building hash accounts of drunken soldiers. Ancient writers occasionally mock drunken soldiers, particularly in satire. One anecdote tells of legionaries who, drunk on cheap wine, mistook a local village festival for an enemy ambush and blundered into chaos. Others warn of soldiers so hungover they fell asleep at their posts, punished severely for negligence. But there are also stories of soldiers drinking heroically, celebrating victories until dawn and then marching at sunrise as if nothing had happened. Such tales reinforce the ideal of Roman toughness. A true legionary could drink hard and fight harder. Face with tears of joy the comic side. There's humor, too, in imagining a centurion roaring at his men, half of whom are green-faced and wincing. "On your feet, you scoundrels! Mars doesn't care about your headaches." Or soldiers muttering to one another as they trudge along, "If the Gauls don't kill me, this pounding in my skull surely will." Even in their misery, camaraderie softened the blow. Misery shared is misery halved, and hangovers in the ranks became a collective joke, part of the lore of soldiering. Globe showing Europe-Africa hangovers as equalizers. The legionary hangover reveals another truth: wine was the great equalizer. Emperors drank in marble halls, soldiers drank in dusty camps. Both woke with aching heads. The difference lay in circumstance. A senator could call for cabbage and honey water, recline in a shaded villa, and nurse his pain. A legionary had no such luxury. He shouldered his shield, tightened his belt, and marched. In this way, the soldier's hangover captures the harshness of Roman life. Pleasure was permitted, even encouraged, but duty always came first. Wine might dull the loneliness of distant campaigns, but the morning after brought discipline crashing back with merciless clarity. When we imagine gladiators, we see bronzed warriors striding into the arena, muscles gleaming, eyes focused, swords flashing. Rarely do we picture them green-faced, stomachs churning, and heads throbbing from too much cheap wine the night before. Yet for gladiators and entertainers in Rome, alcohol was as common as blood. Their lives were perilous, their deaths often imminent, and drink provided relief, bonding, and bravado. But the hangovers that followed collided brutally with their professions, where mistakes meant ridicule or death. Wineglass drink in the gladiator schools. Gladiators lived in ludi, training schools that were part barracks, part prison. They were fed a high-carbohydrate diet heavy on barley, beans, and gruel, earning them the nickname horderii, barley men. But alongside food came wine. Cheap, plentiful, and rough, it was issued to dull pain, boost courage, and make harsh lives more bearable. Drinking bonded the fighters. Men facing death in the arena found solace in cups shared by torchlight, toasts to fortune, and laughter in the face of doom. Yet overindulgence left them staggering into training the next morning, sweating wine through their pores as their instructors barked commands. Crossed swords hashed the arena with a hangover. Now imagine fighting in the amphitheater hungover. The roar of 50,000 spectators crashes like thunder in your skull. The blazing sun blinds already bloodshot eyes. Each clang of sword on shield reverberates in the head like Vulcan's hammer. Nausea twists the stomach as you lunge, dodge, and parry. For an entertainer whose life literally depended on precision, a hangover was no joke. A sluggish step or slow reaction could mean death. And yet, gladiators fought hungover all the same, sometimes heroically, sometimes disastrously. Performing arts actors and performers. Actors, musicians, and dancers also drank heavily. Banquets and festivals demanded long nights of performance, often fueled by wine. For actors, alcohol loosened inhibitions and added energy to comic routines. But the next morning brought cracked voices, trembling limbs, and forgotten lines. Roman audiences were unforgiving. A performer stumbling or slurring from a hangover risked heckling, jeers, or even physical objects hurled from the crowd. The theater was both stage and battlefield, and a performer's hangover was a dangerous liability. Classical building / literary glimpses. Roman writers occasionally mock hungover performers. Juvenal sneers at actors with hoarse voices after nights of revelry, unable to deliver their lines. Martial lampoons musicians who reeked of wine as they tuned their lyres. Even gladiators appear in satire as figures of pity, their bravado undermined by wobbly knees and pale faces. These glimpses remind us that the spectacle of Rome was built not only on grandeur but also on human frailty. Behind the polished masks and shining helmets were men and women groaning with the same miseries as any banquet guest. Scales / alcohol as coping mechanism. For gladiators and entertainers, drink wasn't just indulgence, it was a coping mechanism. The life of a gladiator was brutal, training injuries, fear of death, the constant pressure of survival. Actors, too, faced insecurity, low status, and the cruelty of audiences. Wine dulled these anxieties, granting temporary relief. The hangover, then, was part of the cost of that relief. To wake aching and weak was preferable to facing fear sober the night before. In this way, the hangover became woven into the survival strategies of Rome's most precarious professions. Face with tears of joy the comic sighed. Still, one can't help but imagine the comic absurdity. A gladiator stumbling into the arena, muttering, "If the lions don't get me, this headache will." Or an actor forgetting his lines, blaming Bacchus, while the crowd roars with laughter. Slaves backstage no doubt chuckled as they propped up wobbling performers, whispering, "Our master could outdrink Bacchus himself, but can't even stand on cue today." Globe showing Europe-Africa hangovers as levelers. What makes this striking is the leveling effect. Gladiators, though slaves or outcasts, and actors, though lowly in status, shared in the same cycle as senators and generals: wine at night, misery at dawn. The hangover crossed boundaries of class and profession, linking men in armor with men in togas, women on stage with matrons at feasts. In the amphitheater, the crowds are only spectacle. But behind the scenes, hangovers were as common as bruises, a hidden part of the daily grind of Roman entertainment. If senators could nurse their hangovers in shaded atria, and gladiators fought through theirs in the roar of the arena, what about the majority of Romans, the plebeians? Shopkeepers, craftsmen, street hawkers, bakers, and builders all drank wine, often cheap and sour, and all woke up with headaches just as fierce as the elite. But for them, the morning after was not softened by servants or postponed duties. A hangover had to be carried into the market, the workshop, or the field. Wineglass the cheap wines of the poor. For plebeians, the fine Falernian wines of the elite were out of reach. Instead, they drank rough vintages, often adulterated, sour, or half-spoiled. Laura, a weak wine made from repressing grape skins, was common among the poor. Posca, vinegar diluted with water, was the staple for soldiers and laborers alike. These drinks were less intoxicating than elite wines but often consumed in larger quantities. Worse, they were harsh on the stomach. Drinking too much Laura or Posca left the body not only dehydrated but also unsettled from the acidity. The result? Hangovers marked by queasy guts and pounding heads, compounded by hunger. Sun with face the market morning. Imagine a plebeian rising before dawn in a cramped insular apartment block. The head aches, the stomach churns, but there's no time to wallow. Bread must be sold, fish must be hawked, crafts must be set up at stalls. By the time the sun peaks over the rooftops, the forum and marketplaces are already alive with shouting, haggling, and clattering carts. For a hungover vendor, this was torture. Every cry of fresh olives or fine garum pierced the skull like a dagger. The stench of fish in the heat made nausea swell. And yet, there was no choice but to push through, because daily survival depended on every sale. Hammer and wrench hangovers in the workshop. Craftsmen fared no better. A blacksmith pounding iron with a hammer while his head throbbed felt every strike echo in his skull. A potter, dizzy at his wheel, risked wobbling clay. A mason, unsteady on scaffolding, faced genuine danger. Unlike senators, plebeians could not hide their frailty. It threatened both their livelihood and their safety. The hangover of the working class was thus both more immediate and more perilous. To be sluggish was not just embarrassing, it was costly, sometimes fatal. Bread, onions and folk remedies. What did plebeians do to soften the blow? Their cures were simple and accessible. Bread, onions, garlic, and beans were common morning foods, thought to settle the stomach and provide strength. Some drank water sweetened with honey if they could afford it. Others turned to cabbage, following Cato's advice, though often boiled rather than raw. There is evidence that simple soups, grain porridges or pulses were morning staples after heavy drinking, easy to digest and restorative. Whether these worked scientifically or not, they provided comfort and routine. Faced with tears of joy comic scenes among the poor. The poor, too, found humor in the hangover. One can imagine fishmongers mocking a neighbor whose shouts were hoarse, or cobblers laughing at a colleague who nodded off at his bench. Street life was full of teasing and gossip, and a visible hangover was fair game. Yet there was also solidarity. Drinking was often communal, in taverns or shared jugs, and so too was the misery. A group of bakers trudging into the ovens together, groaning about last night's sour wine, shared the pain in laughter. Scales social contrast. The plebeian hangover highlights Rome's stark social contrasts. The elite could wallow in luxury cures and quiet gardens. The poor had to drag themselves into noisy markets and dangerous workshops. And yet, both were united by the same human frailty, the mourning after regret. Wine leveled Rome in its own way, making misery universal even as circumstances shaped its form. Globe showing Europe-Africa the eternal worker's burden. Across history, working people have always had the hardest hangovers, not because they drank more, but because they could least afford the downtime. Rome was no different. The plebeian hangover was a daily reality, endured with bread, onions, humor, and resilience. If the patrician reclined in marbled atria and the senator drank from golden cups, the ordinary Roman often found his wine in humbler surroundings, the popini. These taverns and drinking dens, scattered across Rome's insulae and lining the roads of the empire, were the beating heart of working-class drinking culture. Here, wine was cheap, company was loud, and hangovers were guaranteed. Abandoned house what were popini? A popina was a tavern, inn, or bar, often a dingy establishment with benches, wooden cups, and smoky air. Archaeologists in Pompeii have uncovered dozens of them, narrow rooms opening onto the street, with counters where amphorae of wine were stored. These were not refined dining rooms, they were noisy, crowded spaces filled with laborers, freedmen, travelers, and sometimes soldiers on leave. Unlike elite banquets, where wine was diluted with water and carefully rationed by a symposiarch, taverns often served stronger, cheaper drink. The goal wasn't elegant conversation but quick intoxication. And with intoxication came disorder. Wine glass, the cheapness of wine. In Popeny, the wine on offer was usually the rough stuff, Laura, made from pressed grape skins, or Posca, sour and acidic. It was affordable, which made it attractive to those who lived hand-to-mouth. But it was also harsher, likely to cause stomach upsets and violent headaches the following morning. Wine might also be adulterated, stretched with water, flavored with resin or ash, or even soured deliberately. A man might drink heavily not because he loved the taste but because he sought escape from hardship. The hangover, then, was the price of temporary relief. Game day gambling, games and fights. Popeny weren't just about drinking. They were places of gambling, chatter, and occasionally brawls. Dice rattled across counters, wagers were shouted, and fortunes in coins or favors were won and lost. Tempers flared quickly when wine flowed, and taverns were notorious for fights. The atmosphere made hangovers doubly punishing. A man might wake not only with a headache but also with bruises, missing coins, or shame from last night's quarrel. Roman authorities often associated taverns with crime and disorder, seeing them as hotbeds of vice. Women and taverns. Respectable women were not supposed to drink in taverns, but reality was more complicated. Inscriptions and literary jabs suggest that taverns sometimes doubled as brothels, with women serving wine and offering other services. For female entertainers and servers, tavern life was perilous, exposing them to drunken abuse. And for those women who drank alongside men, the stigma was sharp. A woman seen staggering out of a popina risked her reputation. Dizzyface the morning after in the tavern's world. What did the hangover look like for tavern-goers? Likely harsher than for elites. Imagine a mason who spent his meager wages on sour wine, waking in a cramped insular room with no food to hand and a full day's labor ahead. Or a traveler who staggered out of a roadside tavern only to face a long march under the sun. The cheapness of the drink, the lack of cures, and the physical demands of plebeian life meant the tavern hangover was brutal. And yet, taverns remained full night after night, proof that the lure of wine outweighed the fear of its price. Face with tears of joy comic scenes. The comedy of tavern hangovers writes itself. Picture dice still clutched in a drunkard's hand as he snores on a bench. Or two men waking in the same tavern corner, blearily trying to remember why their noses are blooded. Or the tavern keeper rolling his eyes as yet another customer groans, "Never again," knowing full well he'll see him that evening. Scales hash social status and stigma. Taverns carried stigma. Elite writers sneered at them as dens of thieves and degenerates. To be seen frequenting one was to risk being judged unrespectable. Yet for many Romans, they were the only place to socialize affordably. The hangover from a tavern night carried not only physical misery but also social shame, the disapproving glances of neighbors, the whispers of gossip. Globe showing Europe-Africa the popina hangover in context. The tavern hangover represents a different side of Rome than the banquet hangover. It wasn't gilded, perfumed, or attended by slaves. It was raw, noisy, and public. It belonged to the vast majority of Romans who worked, drank, and suffered in less than glamorous conditions. In this way, it tells us more about the empire's daily reality than marble villas ever could. Wine in Rome was not merely a beverage, it was sacred. The gods themselves were bound up in its grape-scented vapors. Bacchus, the Roman name for Dionysus, the god of wine, frenzy, and ecstasy, presided over the cup. To drink was to commune with him, to taste divine madness. Other deities, too, had their share in the vine. Ceres, goddess of agriculture, presided over the harvest, while Liber Pater embodied fertility and freedom. Drinking wasn't only tolerated in Rome's religious life, it was woven into it. And where there was sacred intoxication, there were also sacred hangovers. Grapes. Bacchic rites. The Bacchic cult, imported from Greece, offered participants ecstatic release. Followers gathered in secret, drank deeply, danced wildly, and surrendered to frenzy. To outsiders, these rites seemed scandalous, tales spread of women tearing animals apart with their bare hands in drunken ecstasy. The Senate even suppressed the cult in 186 BCE, fearing its disorder. But for those within, Bacchic rites were liberation, an escape from the daily grind, a taste of divine intoxication. The morning after, however, must have been punishing. Imagine initiates staggering back to their households, bodies sore from dancing, heads pounding from endless cups, whispers of scandal clinging to them alongside the smell of sour wine. Performing arts. Saturnalia, a festival of excess. If Bacchic rites were fringe, Saturnalia was mainstream. This December festival, honoring Saturn, turned Rome upside down. Masters served slaves, social rules dissolved, gambling and feasting flourished, and above all, wine flowed without restraint. For several days, Rome was one giant party. Taverns overflowed, households hosted raucous feasts, and even the sternest senators donned silly hats and shouted toasts. The hangovers afterwards must have been monumental, not just individual headaches, but citywide misery. Imagine thousands of Romans groaning simultaneously, markets half empty, and temples filled with worshippers too dizzy to stand straight. Writers hint at this aftermath. Martial quips about swollen bellies and heavy heads after Saturnalia binges. Seneca complains that the chaos of the festival left men sluggish and irrational for days. The festival hangover was both private and public, a collective groan from a city that had drowned itself in wine. Ritual drinking in temples. Even outside festivals, drinking had religious roles. Libations of wine were poured to the gods at nearly every ceremony. Priests sipped ritual cups, sacrifices were washed down with wine, and banquets in honor of deities always included drinking. Religious duty and indulgence blurred, making drunkenness not merely tolerated but sanctified. This could lead to peculiar contradictions. A man might excuse his overindulgence by claiming piety, "I drank deeply, but only for Bacchus' glory." Yet the god's blessings rarely extended to soothing the pounding head the next morning. The divine ecstasy faded quickly, leaving mortals to suffer in silence. Faced with tears of joy. Festival comedy. It is easy to imagine the comic scenes of festival hangovers. Entire streets bleary-eyed, toga hems stained with wine. Priests fumbling through rituals, forgetting lines of prayers because their heads throbbed. Slaves grinning as they reminded their masters of humiliating antics during Saturnalia's role reversal. Yesterday you served me wine, today you can't lift your head. The collective nature of festival hangovers must also have fostered a sense of camaraderie. If everyone was groaning together, the shame was less. Saturnalia was as much about shared regret as shared joy. Scales. The moralists versus festivals. Philosophers loathed these festivals of indulgence. Seneca, ever stern, condemned Saturnalia's excess as proof of moral decay. Livy lamented the Bacchic rites as threats to Rome's discipline. But suppression rarely lasted. The festivals returned year after year, because wine, joy, and excess were irresistible. And the hangovers that followed were simply part of the rhythm of ritual life. globe showing Europe-Africa hangovers as sacred. In this way, Rome elevated even hangovers to a kind of sacred status. They were the afterglow of divine celebration, the price of touching the gods. To stagger through the forum with a pounding head after Saturnalia was not just personal folly, it was participation in something larger, a citywide communion with Bacchus. For philosophers, the hangover was a moral failing. For poets, it was comedy. But for Roman doctors, it was a medical condition, a disruption of the body's delicate balance of humors. Physicians like Galen, Celsus, and Scribonius Largus analyzed drunkenness with clinical curiosity, diagnosing causes and prescribing treatments. While their methods may sound strange to us today, they reveal how the Romans attempted to apply reason and medicine to the age-old problem of the morning after. Scales hash the humoral theory. Roman medicine, heavily influenced by Greek traditions, revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these fluids in balance. Wine, being hot and wet by nature, was thought to disturb this balance, heating the body and inflaming the humors. A hangover, therefore, was interpreted as a system out of harmony. Excess heat produced fevers, excess phlegm led to sluggishness, bile caused nausea, and imbalance clouded the mind. The cure lay in restoring balance, cooling what was overheated, drying what was overly wet, and purging what was excessive. Scroll Celsus approach. Celsus, in his Encyclopedic de Medicina, 1st century CE, gave practical advice for treating drunkenness. He recommended drinking water or diluted vinegar to restore balance, resting in a cool place, and avoiding heavy foods until the stomach had settled. For more severe cases, he suggested emetics, deliberate vomiting, to expel the corrupted humors. Celsus' advice was, in essence, an early version of rehydrate, rest, and don't overdo it. Sensible, though hardly pleasant. Amphora Galen's prescriptions. Galen, the most famous physician of the Roman Empire, 2nd century CE, took a more analytical approach. He categorized wines by strength, age, and additives, noting their differing effects on the body. Sweet, heavy wines produced phlegm and lethargy, sharp wines heated the body excessively. For hangovers, Galen prescribed mild foods, soups, boiled vegetables, or light bread, to stabilize the stomach. He also advised warm baths, massage with oils, and moderate exercise to move the humors gently. In more serious cases, he turned to purgatives, drawing toxins out through vomiting or laxatives. Though some of his ideas sound odd, Galen's emphasis on hydration, rest, and light foods aligns surprisingly well with modern advice. Scribonius Largus and remedies. Other physicians added their own concoctions. Scribonius Largus, 1st century CE, listed herbal cures, including mint, myrrh, and pepper in wine. Some were meant to stimulate digestion, others to calm the stomach. Honey was often recommended, both for its sweetness and supposed balancing properties. There were also stranger recipes, mixtures of ashes, herbs, and even animal products. Whether these helped or only worsened the nausea is difficult to say. Face with bandaged head the role of purging. Vomiting, deliberate or otherwise, was central to Roman medical thought. If wine had unsettled the humors, the quickest way to restore order was to expel it. Physicians sometimes encouraged patients to drink warm water until they vomited, flushing out the stomach. This grim remedy, though unpleasant, may have provided genuine relief. Modern medicine acknowledges that clearing irritants can ease symptoms, though it hardly makes for a dignified morning. Face with tears of joy, doctors versus drinkers. It is easy to imagine the frustration of Roman doctors, patiently prescribing moderation, cabbage, and honey water, while their patients staggered from feast to feast. Galen himself worked as physician to emperors, men notorious for indulgence. One wonders how many times he sighed as yet another noble groaned, "Galen, cure me of Bacchus' cruelty." The gap between medical advice and human behavior was as wide in Rome as it is today. Doctors counseled moderation, Romans drank anyway. The hangover was proof that medicine could only do so much against appetite. Globe showing Europe-Africa legacy of Roman medicine. Roman medical approaches to hangovers reveal the blend of superstition, humoral theory, and observation that characterized ancient science. Some remedies, hydration, light food, honey, genuinely helped. Others, owl eggs, ashes, purging, were less effective. Yet their effort to treat the hangover scientifically shows an enduring truth: humans hate suffering without explanation. The Romans sought not only cures but meaning, fitting their misery into the framework of humors and balance. When the head of state suffers a hangover, it is no longer a private matter. In Rome, where the emperor embodied power itself, his drinking habits set the tone for the empire. Some emperors prided themselves on moderation, presenting sober dignity. Others reveled in excess, turning the palace into a perpetual banquet hall. Their hangovers were whispered about in the streets, mocked by satirists, and sometimes even influenced politics. Grapes Augustus, the moderate drinker. The first emperor, Augustus, set an example of restraint. Suetonius tells us he preferred weak wine, diluted almost to water, and avoided excess. His careful image of sobriety contrasted with the chaos of the late Republic, when drunken senators and generals brawled at feasts. Augustus' moderation symbolized stability. But even he was not immune. Occasional overindulgence at festivals or during diplomatic banquets must have left him groaning the next morning, though sources are polite enough not to dwell on it. Augustus understood that an emperor seen staggering through the forum would undermine his authority. His hangovers, if they occurred, were hidden behind closed doors. Classical building Tiberius, Biberius the drunkard. Augustus' successor, Tiberius, had a far less flattering reputation. Nicknamed Biberius, from biber, to drink, he was mocked for his heavy consumption of wine. On the island of Capri, where he retreated in later years, he allegedly indulged in endless feasts and drunken revels. The hangovers of Tiberius became part of the empire's gossip. Suetonius describes him as sluggish and cruel, hinting that his bad temper was fueled by overindulgence. Whether fair or exaggerated, the image of an emperor nursing sour stomachs while governing added to Rome's unease under his reign. Performing arts Caligula, madness and wine. Caligula, infamous for erratic behavior, was also known for heavy drinking. Ancient sources paint him as paranoid, violent, and theatrical in excess. While some of these accounts are colored by hostility, his late-night feasts and impulsive orders suggest a man often fueled, or unbalanced, by wine. One can easily picture the imperial hangover as dangerous in his case, a ruler waking irritable, head-pounding, lashing out at courtiers or guards. When absolute power meets mourning after misery, the result could be deadly. Multiple musical notes. Nero, the endless banquet. Nero, lover of theater and music, turned indulgence into performance. His banquets were legendary, stretching into dawn, filled with exotic dishes and endless wine. Petronius Satyricon, though fictional, reflects the atmosphere of Nero's Rome: grotesque gluttony, drunken hosts, and humiliating spectacles. For Nero, wine was part of his self-image as an artist king, breaking free of Roman austerity. Yet his excess also meant imperial hangovers on a grand scale. Imagine Nero, crowned with roses, waking with pounding temples, still smelling of last night's perfumes and garlands, summoning slaves for honey water before staggering to his lyre. Shield Commodus and the gladiator emperor. Later emperors, like Commodus, also indulged heavily. Commodus styled himself as a gladiator, fighting in the arena after nights of wine-soaked feasts. His stamina must have been tested by hangovers as he donned armor and paraded before crowds. Ancient sources describe him as unstable and unpredictable, his drunken antics part of the empire's decline. Face with tears of joy imperial hangover humor. The image of emperors hungover was irresistible to critics and commoners alike. A groaning emperor was the great equalizer, no matter how divine he claimed to be, Bacchus still humbled him. Rumors surely flew, the emperor raged today because his head ached from last night's Falernian. Gossip linked bad decisions, cruel punishments, or sudden decrees to sour mornings after feasts. Satirists delighted in portraying emperors as slaves to their stomachs, stripped of dignity by drink. Scales hangovers and power. The consequences could be serious. A general hungover before battle might falter. An emperor hungover before an audience might appear weak or ridiculous. In an empire where image mattered immensely, the hangover was not just private pain but political liability. Moderation, as Augustus knew, was as much a tool of power as sobriety itself. Globe showing Europe-Africa the imperial example. Ultimately, the emperors reflected Rome itself, torn between austerity and excess, discipline and indulgence. The imperial hangover was the empire's hangover, magnified by palace walls. Whether hidden or flaunted, it revealed the eternal truth that even the most powerful man in the world could not escape Bacchus' revenge the next morning. When it comes to drinking in ancient Rome, men dominate the sources. Poets mock drunken senators, satirists laugh at bleary-eyed gladiators, and philosophers scold wine-soaked youths. But what of women? The story is more complicated. Roman attitudes toward female drinking shifted over centuries, from harsh restrictions in the early Republic to indulgent freedoms in the Empire. And behind those shifting rules lurk hangovers, women waking with pounding heads, queasy stomachs, and the added weight of social stigma. Classical building early restrictions. In the stern days of the early Republic, female drinking was heavily restricted. According to legend, a husband could even punish his wife, sometimes fatally, if she was caught drinking wine. This rule, though likely exaggerated, reflected anxieties about female chastity. Wine, after all, was linked to loosened inhibitions and sexual freedom. To drink was to risk transgressing the rigid boundaries of Roman matronly virtue. Thus, women were often restricted to sipping diluted wine in ritual contexts or special occasions. Their hangovers in this era, if they existed, would have been rare and scandalous. Grapes: the imperial shift. By the imperial period, attitudes had loosened. Elite women attended banquets alongside men, reclining on couches, raising cups, and even playing drinking games. Empresses like Livia and Messalina were whispered about in connection with wine, Livia as the careful matron, Messalina as the scandalous overindulger. Still, female drinking carried a double standard. A man drunk at a feast was expected, even laughed off. A woman drunk risked censure, gossip, and mockery. Her hangover was not just physical but reputational, evidence of overstepping boundaries. Scroll satirists on drunken women. Roman satirists delighted in attacking drunken women. Juvenal, in his biting sixth satire, describes wives staggering home reeking of wine, collapsing on their couches, and snoring through prayers. He paints grotesque pictures of matrons vomiting in the street or demanding more cups at dawn. Whether true or exaggerated, these depictions show the stigma: a woman's hangover was not comic relief but a moral failing. Her bleary eyes and foul breath were symbols of decadence, used as weapons by critics of female freedom. Disefface the female morning after. What would a Roman woman's hangover have felt like? Much the same as a man's: pounding head, sour stomach, aching limbs. But the consequences differed. An elite matron waking with a hangover might dread not only her own misery but the sharp eyes of her husband, the whispers of slaves, or the wagging tongues of neighbors. Even empresses weren't immune. Imagine Messalina after an all-night feast, summoning attendants with a headache and dry mouth, yet forced to appear poised by mid-morning, lest gossip spread through the palace. For women, there was no room for weakness. Bacchus' revenge carried social as well as physical pain. Honeypot remedies for women. Did women use the same cures? Likely so. Honey water, cabbage, and light porridges were universal. But women may also have turned to cosmetics to mask their hangovers, scented oils to disguise sour breath, powders to cover pallor, kohl to brighten bleary eyes. Their cures extended beyond the stomach to the social performance of respectability. Face with tears of joy the comic side. Despite the stigma, there is humor in imagining female hangovers. A matron clutching her temples during morning prayers, muttering oaths to Bacchus. An empress demanding owl eggs from panicked slaves, only to retch at the sight. Or a gaggle of women the morning after Saturnalia, sharing the same groans and remedies as their husbands, proving misery was, at least once a year, equally shared. Scales hash wine, women and power. Women's drinking habits reflected broader tensions in Roman society, between freedom and control, pleasure and virtue, patriarchy and personal agency. The hangover became a battleground of symbolism. A man's hangover was indulgence, a woman's was transgression. And yet, women drank anyway. Despite the stigma, they joined feasts, raised cups, and endured Bacchus' punishments just like men. Globe showing Europe, Africa the universal groan. In the end, the female hangover was not so different from the male one. Beneath the layers of social expectation, the biology was the same: headaches, nausea, regret. Whether in the shaded villa of a senator's wife or the noisy insula of a tavern worker, Roman women too whispered the same timeless vow, numquam iterum, never again. The Romans loved to laugh at themselves, and at each other. Nowhere is this clearer than in their literature, where drunkenness and its aftermath appear again and again. From high satire to ribald epigrams, poets and playwrights delighted in turning hangovers into material for moral scolding, comic exaggeration, and biting social commentary. For Roman audiences, the misery of the morning after was not only familiar, it was endlessly entertaining. Scroll the satirist's playground. Juvenal, Martial, and Horace all mined hangovers for comic gold. Juvenal, master of moral outrage, painted grotesque pictures of drunken nobles staggering through the forum, their heads throbbing as they attempted to speak in court. He mocked women who reeked of sour wine at dawn, their hangovers symbols of social decay. Martial, ever the witty epigrammatist, was merciless. He teased friends and patrons alike for their bleary eyes and sour breath. One of his sharpest barbs likened a man's morning after odor to a tavern floor. Another jested that the only cure for his friend's hangover was to drink again, a line that feels as modern as any student joke. Horace, by contrast, was more indulgent. He acknowledged the pleasures of wine and occasionally chuckled at his own excess. In his odes, he admits to waking groggy after nights of revelry, pleading with his slaves for simple remedies. His humor carried a gentle self-awareness. Even poets, he reminds us, are not immune to Bacchus' revenge. Performing arts comedy on the stage. Hangovers also found their way into Roman comedy. Building on Greek models, playwrights filled their stages with bumbling drunkards, confused slaves, and hungover masters. The morning after scene, a character clutching his head, groaning, and stumbling, was a stock comic trope, instantly recognizable to audiences. The theater amplified the humor. Slurred speech, exaggerated gags, and slapstick falls mirrored real-life banquets but made them safe to laugh at. In a society where public drunkenness carried shame, comedy allowed people to laugh at what they all secretly endured. Wineglass the hangover as moral lesson. Yet satire was never just entertainment. Roman writers wielded hangovers as moral symbols. To Juvenal, the hungover aristocrat was proof of Rome's decadence. To Seneca, the groaning drunkard embodied weakness of will. Even Martial, behind his jokes, implied criticism. Excess was ridiculous, and hangovers were its punishment. This dual role, comic and didactic, reflects Roman attitudes toward pleasure. Wine was acceptable, even celebrated, but only within limits. To be visibly hungover was to expose yourself to ridicule and scorn. Literature reinforced this boundary, policing behavior through laughter. Face with tears of joy stock imagery. Certain images recur so often they became cliches. Bloodshot eyes squinting in sunlight. Trembling hand spilling water. Sour breath compared to vinegar or garum. Groans mistaken for prayers to the gods. These details reveal how universal hangovers were. The very consistency of the jokes proves that Romans recognized the symptoms just as we do today. The humor lands because everyone had been there, or at least seen someone who had. Thinking face self-mockery. Interestingly, some poets turned the hangover joke inward. Horace often mocked himself as much as others, admitting to sluggish mornings and promising moderation next time. This self-awareness gave his verses charm, showing that even Rome's intellectuals were not above indulgence. Such honesty also humanized the poets. Readers saw themselves in Horace's groans or Martial's sharp jabs at friends. The hangover became a shared human experience, bridging gaps of class and status. Globe showing Europe-Africa cultural resonance. The literary hangover reflects a broader Roman truth, that life was lived in cycles of feast and regret. Banquets, taverns, and festivals gave joy, mornings gave pain. Writers captured this rhythm, exaggerating it for laughs or using it as a warning. Their words remind us that culture isn't just built on triumphs and battles but also on headaches, sour stomachs, and vows of never again. Scales hash the eternal joke. What stands out is how modern these jokes feel. Replace amphorae with bottles, togas with suits, and garum with kebab shops, and the humor still works. The hangover transcends centuries. Martial teasing his friend in the 1st century CE sounds remarkably like one friend texting another in the 21st, still alive after last night. Roman art immortalized emperors, generals, and gods, but it also delighted in everyday life. Alongside triumphal arches and marble statues, there were tavern signs, mosaics in dining rooms, and graffiti scrawled on plaster walls. These sources give us glimpses of how ordinary Romans viewed drinking and, by extension, the misery of the morning after. The hangover, though rarely depicted explicitly, lurks in these artifacts, hinted at through humor, caricature, and everyday detail. Abandoned house hash graffiti in Pompeii and Herculaneum. The volcanic ash that preserved Pompeii also preserved its tavern walls, covered with graffiti. Among boasts of drinking contests and crude jokes, we find hints of hangovers. One inscription reads, "I drank more than 5 others and still stand," a boast that almost certainly ended in mourning regret. Another simply states, "Wine is my ruin." While no graffitist admits, "I woke with a headache," the humor and complaints imply familiarity with the consequences. Scribbled drawings of stumbling figures, overturned cups, or crude caricatures of bloated men reinforce the sense of communal laughter at drunken excess. Performing arts. Tavern art. Some taverns decorated their walls with paintings of drinkers or Dionysian scenes. These often showed satyrs, half-man, half-goat companions of Bacchus, drinking to excess, collapsing or vomiting in comic abandon. The message was twofold: the tavern was a place of pleasure, but also of folly. For customers raising cups beneath these murals, the images must have felt both funny and familiar, reminders that too much wine would bring both ecstasy and pain. Amphora mosaics in villas. In elite homes, mosaics often depicted symposium scenes, diners reclining, servants pouring wine, musicians playing. Some mosaics go further, showing the aftermath. In Ansh, one mosaic portrays a drunken Heracles slumped against a companion, cup still in hand. In another, a figure labeled Como's revelry stumbles forward, eyes glazed. These images were both decorative and didactic. They entertained guests but also reminded them of the fine line between joy and disgrace. To see Heracles, a hero, undone by wine was a cautionary tale. Even the mighty could not escape Bacchus' punishments. Grape satyrs and hangovers in art. Satyrs, ever associated with Bacchus, became stock figures for drunkenness. Vase paintings, reliefs, and mosaics show them staggering, vomiting, or collapsing in heaps. Their wild hair and twisted poses are exaggerated caricatures of what every Roman had seen at a feast or tavern, men reduced to comic wrecks by too much wine. By projecting these traits onto mythical creatures, Romans could laugh at human folly while distancing themselves from it. Yet the laughter was surely tinged with recognition. Satyr art was funny because it was true. Disefface visual codes of hangover. Art rarely shows the hangover directly. Few mosaics depict men groaning with headaches in the morning sun. But certain visual codes suggest it. Figures with drooping heads, clutching bellies, or leaning on companions evoke the physical toll of overindulgence. Paired with spilled cups and overturned amphorae, the implication is clear. These images capture not just drunkenness but its aftermath. To any Roman guest stepping carefully into the light after a night of wine, they must have felt painfully accurate. Domestic versus public spaces. Interestingly, depictions of drunkenness and implied hangovers appear both in elite villas and in humble taverns. This suggests universality. All classes recognized the comic and cautionary potential. In villas, the art reminded guests of moderation. In taverns, it invited them to laugh at excess while indulging anyway. Face with tears of joy. Humor in visual culture. Like literature, visual art treated hangovers as comic relief. The satyr clutching his head, the stumbling Heracles, the graffiti of a boasting drunkard, all reflect a society that found humor in the pain of excess. Art became another medium for the eternal joke: drink too much, and Bacchus will have his revenge. Globe showing Europe, Africa, everyday life immortalized. What stands out is how ordinary these depictions are. The same culture that built aqueducts and temples also scratched jokes about wine onto tavern walls. The hangover was not monumental, but it was memorable enough to be preserved in art. These traces remind us that Rome was not just marble and power but also headaches, regrets, and laughter at human weakness. To understand Roman hangovers, we must also understand the economy behind them. Wine in Rome was not just a drink, it was an industry. Vast vineyards sprawled across Italy, Gaul, and Hispania, amphorae laden with wine-filled merchant ships, taverns and popini sold it by the cup, and fortunes were made on the backs of the vine. Every hangover was, in its way, evidence of Rome's economic engine at work. Grapes the scale of the wine trade. By the 1st century CE, wine was Rome's most important commodity after grain. Archaeologists have uncovered massive wine presses in Gaul and Hispania, evidence of industrial-scale production. Amphorae stamped with vintners marks litter Mediterranean shipwrecks, proof of how far Roman wine traveled. This abundance made wine available to all classes. The elite could sip Falernian, famed for its strength and quality, while the poor could buy rough Laura for a few coins. The universality of wine meant the universality of hangovers. Everyone, from senators to sailors, had access to both pleasure and pain. Amphora, amphorae, and distribution. The amphora, the clay jar used to transport wine, became a symbol of Rome's drinking culture. They were stacked in warehouses, loaded onto ships, and carried through city streets. Some amphorae even bore humorous inscriptions about their contents: strong wine, weak wine, sweet wine. One can imagine merchants joking about whose product caused the worst morning after headaches. Distribution networks ensured that even remote provinces received wine. Soldiers on the frontiers drank as heartily as citizens in Rome. Hangovers, then, were not confined to the capital. They stretched from Britannia to Syria, wherever amphorae arrived. Money-bag taverns and local profits. Taverns were not only social spaces but economic hubs. Tavern keepers, often freedmen or foreigners, made steady profit selling cheap wine by the jug. The steady demand guaranteed by drinkers, and their inevitable return the next evening despite their groans that morning, made taverns resilient businesses. The hangover was, paradoxically, good for business. Each morning, customers swore never again. Each evening, they returned, coins in hand. Backers punished their bodies, but tavern keepers reaped the rewards. Hammer and wrench hash labor and vineyards. The wine economy also depended on labor, often slave labor. Vineyards required constant care, pruning, harvesting, pressing. Slaves worked under the sun, sometimes rewarded with a ration of wine themselves. Their hangovers, if they indulged, were born under harsher conditions than their masters, no leisure to recover, only endless toil among the vines that caused their misery. Scroll literary complaints. Roman writers occasionally grumbled about the economics of drinking. Martial jokes about tavern wine so poor it could strip paint from a wall, yet men still drank it. Juvenal sneered at senators pretending to sip modestly while secretly draining costly vintages. The wine trade was both admired for its prosperity and mocked for its excess. Globe showing Europe-Africa global reach of Roman wine. Wine also became a cultural export. Roman colonists carried their drinking habits abroad, planting vineyards in Gaul, Hispania, and beyond. These regions later became Europe's great wine centers, meaning the Roman hangover shaped not only ancient history but also the modern world of wine. Every glass of Bordeaux or Rioja has roots in amphorae carried across the empire. Face with tears of joy the economic comedy of hangovers. Economically speaking, the hangover was part of the cycle of profit. Groaning Romans sought cures, honey, cabbage, eggs, all of which kept markets thriving. Physicians prescribed remedies for fees, taverns sold hair of the dog, and vineyard owners smiled as customers staggered back for more. Bacchus, it seems, was not only a god of wine but also of commerce. Scales: wealth, class and wine. The economics of hangovers also reflected social divides. The rich could afford fine vintages less likely to upset the stomach, while the poor endured the rougher stuff that guaranteed harsher mornings. Yet even the finest Falernian could betray its drinker if taken in excess. Wealth softened the edges of the hangover but did not erase it. Classical building hashed the hangover as economic engine. In this sense, the Roman hangover was more than misery. It was proof of an economy in motion: vineyards tilled, ships sailed, taverns bustling, markets selling cures. Each headache was a ripple in a vast network of labor, trade, and profit. Rome's empire was built on grain and wine alike, and hangovers were the unavoidable byproduct of prosperity. When one imagines the Roman legions, disciplined ranks, gleaming armor, precision on the battlefield, wine and hangovers rarely come to mind. Yet the Roman army marched not only on discipline and grain but also on wine. Soldiers were supplied with it daily, drank it heartily, and inevitably suffered the same pounding headaches as their civilian counterparts. The hangover in the legions was no less real, it was simply endured under harsher circumstances. Amphora wine as a military ration. Roman soldiers received regular allocations of wine, alongside grain and oil. It was considered essential, both for morale and health. Water was often unsafe, particularly on campaign, but diluted wine was safer to drink. Posca, a mixture of vinegar and water, was a staple, hydrating and sour but reliable. Yet when soldiers gained access to stronger wine, whether through plunder, markets, or generous commanders, overindulgence was inevitable. A cohort celebrating victory could drink well into the night, only to wake the next morning with groggy heads and aching limbs, forced to march 20 miles regardless. Crossed swords hangovers on campaign. A military hangover was uniquely brutal. Imagine rising before dawn in a damp tent, head throbbing, stomach sour, only to hear the centurion's barked orders. There was no time to wallow. The day meant marching in full armor, constructing camps, or engaging the enemy. The clash of shields during drill would have been agony to a hungover soldier. The glare of the sun on bronze helmets made eyes sting. And yet, soldiers carried on, because failure meant flogging, humiliation, or worse. The Roman army had no tolerance for excuses, Bacchus included. Shield commanders and discipline. Roman commanders were well aware of their men's fondness for drink. Julius Caesar, for example, was famously indulgent of his soldiers' excesses, so long as they fought bravely when needed. Tacitus notes that generals sometimes turned a blind eye, knowing that wine boosted morale. But discipline always loomed. Drunkenness on duty was punished severely, sometimes with death. A soldier too hungover to fight endangered the legion. Thus, while wine was encouraged, excess was carefully monitored. The hangover was tolerated, but only if the soldier still performed. Wineglass celebration and excess. Victories often unleashed waves of drinking. After a successful battle or conquest, soldiers plundered enemy stores of wine, filling camps with raucous revelry. These celebrations often ended in spectacular hangovers, with groaning men expected to march the next day regardless. One can imagine the groans of legionaries in Gaul after a night of celebrating with seized amphorae, trudging through mud and rain with pounding heads, cursing their commanders and Bacchus in equal measure. Faced with tears of joy military humor. Like civilians, soldiers made jokes of their misery. Barracks banter must have included endless teasing, one man mocked for snoring drunkenly, another for vomiting in his helmet, another for collapsing mid-march. Shared suffering turned hangovers into bonding experiences, woven into the camaraderie of the legions. Graffiti left by soldiers on frontier walls occasionally mentions wine and excess. A scratched note from Vindelander in Britain hints at drinking parties among officers, reminding us that even on the cold edge of the empire, Bacchus followed. Globe showing Europe-Africa the hangover as leveler in the army. In the legions, hangovers crossed ranks. Commanders attended banquets with officers, ordinary soldiers drank in campfires with comrades. All suffered alike the next morning. The hangover became a rare leveler of hierarchy. A centurion's headache was not so different from that of the rawest recruit. Scales wine, war and resilience. Ultimately, the hangover in the army was not a weakness but part of resilience. Soldiers learned to endure discomfort, whether from wounds, weather, or wine. A legionary who could march 20 miles with a pounding head was as toughened as one who could fight through pain. In this way, the hangover became another form of military training, proof of endurance, discipline, and shared hardship. Classical building the soldier's oath to Bacchus. And yet, it is easy to imagine soldiers cursing Bacchus by the campfire, never again, until tomorrow. Their lives were too uncertain, their pleasures too few, for wine to be resisted for long. The hangover was part of the rhythm of legionary life, a misery endured with grit and humor as the empire expanded on weary, wine-stained legs. As we draw the curtain on Rome's endless nights of feasting, tavern drinking, and wine-fueled celebrations, it is worth pausing to reflect. The hangover, though rarely chronicled in the annals of history, is one of the most revealing experiences of the ancient world. It reminds us that beneath the marble and grandeur, the legions and emperors, the poets and philosophers, Rome was inhabited by people who groaned, staggered, and swore never to drink again, only to raise the cup once more. Grapes, a shared human experience. From the poorest tavern-goer in a smoky popina to Nero in his gilded banquet halls, the hangover touched every level of Roman society. Class determined the quality of the wine and the comfort of the cure, but the misery was universal. A senator's throbbing head was not so different from a soldier's on campaign, nor a matron's from a fishmonger's. Bacchus made no distinction. This universality connects us to the Romans more than their triumphs or monuments ever could. To feel the dry mouth, the pounding skull, the bleary regret, these are sensations as immediate today as they were 2,000 years ago. Classical building what hangovers reveal about Rome. Studying hangovers illuminates Rome in unexpected ways. Society and class, the remedies of the rich, honey, owl eggs, perfumes, contrasted with the poor's bread and onions. Yet all suffered equally. Economy, wine production, trade, and tavern culture sustained the empire. Hangovers were the price paid by consumers, and the profits of vintners. Religion, festivals like Saturnalia celebrated excess, with collective hangovers becoming part of civic life. Bacchus himself demanded tribute in headaches. Military life, soldiers endured hangovers with the same grit as wounds and marches, weaving them into the fabric of discipline. Gender and morality, women's drinking carried extra stigma, their hangovers judged not just as weakness but as scandal. Culture and humor, satirists, comedians, and graffiti artists made hangovers comic material, proof that Romans laughed as much at themselves as we do. The hangover is therefore a lens. Through it, we glimpse Rome not in marble statues or Senate debates but in sweaty bodies, groaning mornings, and vows of never again. Face with tears of joy the comic and tragic balance. For the Romans, the hangover was both punishment and punchline. It was proof of excess, mocked by poets and moralists, yet also shared, laughed at, and endured together. This duality mirrors Rome itself, disciplined yet indulgent, austere yet riotous. The very presence of hangovers in satire, graffiti, mosaics, and medicine shows how deeply entwined they were in daily life. They were not mere side effects but cultural touchstones. Globe showing Europe, Africa, Bacchus' eternal gift. What is perhaps most striking is continuity. Across centuries, the cycle of feast and regret has not changed. The Roman waking groggy after Saturnalia is the same as the modern reveler crawling out of bed on New Year's Day. Remedies differ, cabbage and owl eggs then, coffee and painkillers now, but the human condition is unchanged. In this sense, Bacchus gave Rome a gift that outlasted the empire, not only wine, but the hangover, an eternal reminder of pleasure's price. Sparkle's closing reflection. So what was it like to have a hangover in ancient Rome? It was sweaty gladiators dragging themselves into the arena. It was market sellers squinting in the sun. It was emperors grumbling behind palace doors. It was women applying perfume to mask sour breath. It was soldiers trudging in formation, heads pounding. It was poets scribbling complaints, doctors prescribing cabbage, taverns bustling with laughter despite vows of sobriety. Above all, it was human. Rome may have conquered the known world, built aqueducts, and left monuments that still stand. But in the mornings after their revels, they were just like us, fragile, regretful, and secretly plotting their next drink. The hangover was Rome's most democratic institution, suffered equally, endured universally, and laughed at eternally.